Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray. So good to have you. And today, if you've heard us over the past few months, the debate on where will the price of oil end up this year and how does OPEC play into that? And we bring in a senior energy analyst at the Price Futures Group and Fox Business Network contributor, Flynn, to help us with that. Phil, how's it going today?
Ryan, it's doing fantastic today. It's been an incredible run on energy this year, but I just think we're getting started.
Okay, so let's just kind of get into it because we were talking before we got into the show here, and we have a little bit of a difference of opinion, and so I'd love to get your take on this. Here's my take, and tell me why I'm wrong. I believe that we're still a few months out before we can really see where oil will end up at this year. I think it's a little bit early to say. I'm kind of a pessimist looking at it, thinking that maybe we're going to overdrill here in the U.S. We're not really sure what OPEC's going to do until all that's kind of resolved, which I think probably be the summer. We should probably be a little bit reserved on our expectations. I think you disagree. Tell me why I'm wrong.
I'll tell you why you're wrong is because I think you're underestimating the resolve of the OPEC cartel. And you're not alone. I mean, if you look at everybody in the industry, and you would have told them a year ago that OPEC was going to not only cut production or agree to cut production, but that they were going to have 110% compliance rate, you would have taken that bet. You would have said people were crazy. But I have been amazed, and not really amazed. I knew that OPEC is in a situation right now where they have to get this market in balance. They have a lot more to lose. And I think that they feel that they've already won the oil production war, because if you look at demand growth going forward, and if you look at where the supplies are going to be in a few months from now, you can't look at shale oil producers to make up for that lag. And that's why I think we're going to see a market that's going to be in a supply deficit very, very shortly.
Okay, and so where do you kind of think the prices will be maybe the let's say third and fourth quarter 2017?
I think as we get towards the end of the year, I think we're going to trade to $60. We have to get through 55 to get there because that's where the major resistance is. But I think as we get into the last quarter of the year, when the cold weather starts to heat up a little bit, we're going to see prices trade maybe as high as $73. Now, I don't know if we're going to make that by the end of the year. I think we have a shot, if not the end of the year, this year, early next year. And what we're seeing, Ryan, I think is something we've seen in the energy complex many, many times. We've gone from a boom to a bust cycle to a boom cycle to a bust cycle. And if you remember, say, 15 years ago when you had Goldman Sachs call for a super cycle in oil. Well, I'm calling for a super cycle in oil now. I think people have to realize is that we have seen the biggest pullback in investment in oil in history when it comes to capital spending by the major oil producing countries. And we're looking at shale oil to pick up that slack. It's not going to happen. And that's why I think this market is really going to see much higher prices in the future.
Okay, and just so the audience knows, we're recording this on April 17th, so this will be a little bit before it comes out. So I'm going to reference some current events that may not be as current when this comes out, but I think the premise that you will understand and the audience will follow along as well. One of the things that's concerned me about the price is if you go back and you look at maybe the early 2000s, and I remember reading news articles that would be prices skyrocket at threat of Middle Eastern war, and so maybe Israel was looking to go to war with someone, and prices would just skyrocket. Well, now we have a lot of instability in the Middle East, and it doesn't seem to affect the prices like the fear of war would in the early 2000s. So that's part of my concern. What am I missing that's going on there?
I think you're missing that back then we didn't have a lot of spare production capacity in the globe at that point. If you look at the difference between, supply and demand, OPEC couldn't bring on a lot of production in a short period of time. And there was a perception that even though supplies were relatively ample at that time, there was a concern that if there was a disruption in the Middle East, that would go away very quickly. Now, fast forward to where we are today. What do you hear more about oil from the average person? We've got an oil glut, a glut of supply. I've heard that term glut of supply for the last year, record supplies in the U.S. So when we get these headlines, there seems to be a buffer of supply that sort of cushions the price spike. The problem is, Ryan, that in a few months, that cushion is going to be gone. So now when you get these situations, whether it be North Korea, whether it be a disruption in Syria or in Libya, mainly when you get these disruptions, you are going to see the prices spike quite a bit. Recently, we've had an excess of supply, so it's cushioned the blow. But once we start seeing some of that spare production capacity idled, not being able to bring it on quickly, I think you're going to see more price spikes as we go forward.
Okay, one more question on conflict, and we'll move back to OPEC. Let's say that worst case scenario happens, and maybe there is a conflict with North Korea, or we put more troops than we're expecting in the Middle East. How much impact could you possibly predict that would impact your $70 range that you're talking about? Would it go up to 80, maybe 85, or what are your thoughts on something like that?
I don't know if North Korea is the best example of what would cause a price spike in oil. I mean, obviously, if there were a war with North Korea, it might actually be bullish for oil because you'd use a lot of oil to fight a war. I would think that some of the greater risks to oil may actually be Libya or Nigeria or some of these other countries where they have a big ISIS facility, or maybe even when you talk about perhaps Iraq, which hasn't been necessarily stable in some parts of the country, or even Saudi Arabia, where the tensions around Saudi Arabia with Iran have gone up. So those are the countries that I think that could cause a price spike more in the future. We've already seen the inability of Libya to become a reliable supplier and bring oil back onto the market. If that's taken off for an extended period of time, and then you have another situation in the Middle East, you could see a spike to $80 a barrel. But because OPEC is artificially taking supply off the market, they will be able to ramp up production. But whenever you do that, the demand equation keeps growing. So, every time you take oil off the market and demand keeps growing, it's harder to bring supply back on and catch up to that demand curve.
Okay, and you talked about a lot of OPEC nations there, which is where I want to get back to. What are your thoughts on kind of the predictions that are out there, and I've kind of weighed in on this as well, that OPEC, we may be seeing it kind of unravel, and I was just reading the other day talking about the Saudi Aramco IPO and how that fits into the picture. Is OPEC something that we can see being stable for the next 5 to 10 years, or do you think it is going to eventually unravel in the next decade?
I think, 6 years ago, I wrote a piece called OPEC Rest in Peace. And I started to write about how OPEC would have less influence over the global marketplace and how the shale oil producers would give OPEC a run for their money and they would be in trouble. And that came true almost. I mean, if you look at the OPEC price war that started 2 years ago on Thanksgiving, and when they flooded the market with oil, really OPEC was coming apart at the seams. They couldn't have a quota. They didn't get an agreement. And for all intents and purposes, the OPEC cartel had fallen apart. But it's amazing how you can get people to start working together when they start going broke, right? So, once they had that price crash, it put the fear of God into the OPEC producing nations. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing such good compliance. Saudi Arabia has done a fantastic job getting the cartel back together, making this OPEC production cut actually work. And because of that, now I think the OPEC cartel has proven that it will play a valuable part in the market in the coming years. So just when we thought the OPEC cartel was dead on arrival, the OPEC production war started, they fell apart, and now they put it back together. And so now they're going to be very effective. Listen, I just think people have to realize the historical impact of what's happening now with OPEC compliance. I think I was the only guy in the country that would predicted that they would be as compliant as they are. And this is a real sea change. This is not the OPEC cartel of a few years ago. This is a new OPEC cartel. They're smarter, they're leaner, and in some way they think they've won the production war, and that's why I think they're doing so well.
Okay, so what would be the biggest threat to them now?
I think greed. I think because they're going to start making a lot of money down the road. Listen, everybody thought, and I think the false narrative that's been going on in the market the last few months and years is that OPEC didn't matter because as soon as OPEC would cut production, the shale oil guys would raise production and fill that void. Wouldn't you agree that that's kind of what we've been hearing?
Yeah, no doubt.
Okay, so now, but if you look at what's happened, say OPEC right now, they've cut what, 1.5 million barrels of oil production per day. You add in some non-OPEC production, they're about 50% compliant. They're eventually going to be 100% compliant, or so they say. So you're going to be removing 1.8 million barrels of oil a day from the global market just since last January. Now, since last January, how much has the U.S. producer added to the market? They haven't even quite added, 600,000 barrels a day, from the low. And as impressive as they have been, they haven't been able to get production up to where they were when the price war started. They're getting close, but they're not there yet. Now, if you put that in context, let's say by the end of the year, the shale producers add, say, 600,000 barrels of oil a day. You're still running a deficit of 500 to 600,000 barrels a day from the OPEC production cuts. So the thing people have to remember with the shale producers is that unlike a traditional project, the shale producers have a huge decline rate. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, and I wanted to just kind of interject something there, because you brought up something a second ago, and you said false narratives. And this is something that frustrates me a lot, is that all the variables that you're going through, when you look at, I remember when the oil price started, the war, as you called it, the price war started to happen a few years ago. I was reading articles, and I'm reading Wall Street Journal or oilprice.com or whatever these various sites are, and they're all taking a very small snapshot of what's going on in the marketplace, and they're not expounding upon all these different variables. And so, as you've touched on a multitude of things here, it's quite hard to get a picture from the general media about what is the price doing and what is it affecting it. And why do you think that it's hard? Maybe I'm just looking in the wrong spot sometimes, but why is it so hard for reporters to give us a good, well-rounded picture, as you are doing right now, on what is happening with the price of oil?
I think it's hard. I talk to a lot of reporters. A lot of them do a good job, but they don't want to go too far out of the common narrative, because once you start bringing something up that like shale can't replace a traditional oil project, that requires a lot more space than they can in a daily oil market report. And I think that's the reason. So if I come up and say to you, hey, reporter, yeah, I know this week we're talking about a so-called record supply of oil, and oil production's been going up. Supplies are at a record high. But look at the product inventories, for example. They're falling dramatically. I mean, this is the first time since 2014 they're year over year, they're lower. If you look at total liquid inventories, well, that doesn't fit into a nice, sweet headline that they put in the paper every day. And so to get into that, it takes a lot more deep thinking. The thing that you have to, from the big picture, this reminds me of what's going on in the oil market, of what happened back when oil prices went to $10 a barrel, back in 1999. Do you remember that? Yeah, I'm sure you do.
Yeah. It's been a while, but yeah.
It is. And so basically in 1999, that was the last time oil prices had two down years in a row. And if you go back to 1999, people used to say back then that oil prices couldn't go back up above $30 a barrel. If it did, we'd go into a recession and prices would go back down, and that we'd have a glut of oil. And anytime we needed more oil, OPEC would raise production and push prices back down. And but if you look beyond that, you had a substantial cut in capital spending cuts. You had Exxon buying Mobil in a few years. You had Texaco going out of business. So you had this contraction in capital spending. Then what happened in a few years? We're talking about an oil shortage, right? We couldn't keep up with demand. And so I think we're going through the same thing now. Because prices crashed so hard and so fast, everybody got these false assumptions that, hey, prices won't go back up. Shale oil is going to make up for the $1 trillion of capital spending cuts that the oil companies made. And so there's this false narrative, and then people become comfortable with that. But if you look behind the numbers, it's really kind of a scary situation, especially if you plot it out a year or two.
Okay, and one of the things that you've touched on there, I wanted to ask you about is when you look at the market in the U.S. kind of rebalancing itself, what you see, especially in the Permian right now, is there's a lot of the bigger companies that are buying up large acreage plays. And from my perspective, that's a good thing to stabilize the market here, because they have long-term drilling programs. Their cash flow, how they do their cash flow is a lot different than maybe a smaller producer. What are your thoughts on the big boys, so to speak, getting into the Permian and these other plays and buying up large acreage positions?
I think it's a good thing, but they're also, I think of it as they're going for the cheaper plays and the low-hanging fruit. And this is what's happening. The oil companies, the big oil, has not performed very well. Their earnings have been terrible. Remember a few years ago we were talking about, obscene profits? Well, the last couple of years, big oil's been taking obscene losses. So what we have seen is that the oil companies have cut traditional projects in the trillions of dollars, billions and billions of dollars of pulling back production, but yet they still have to produce oil to make a profit. So what they're doing is they're looking to the Permian Basin and looking to the shale. They're investing big there because, relatively speaking, it's a cheap investment, okay? They don't care about the long-term sustainability of the project, which are not going to be able to get in the Permian Basin. They're looking to make a quick profit. So they figure they can go in, drill a shale well, double their money, and pull out. And if prices go down, it doesn't matter. They've already made back their money, as opposed to some of these other projects that they built a few years ago when oil prices were $80 a barrel, and they spent billions of dollars on these projects where their break-even cost was $60 a barrel, where they're losing big on, okay? The thing is that those projects may produce, for decades, where the shale well may produce for a couple of years. So what I'm getting at is they're looking at the shale plays, which is a positive, to get some quick production, and that's good in the short term, but over the long run, they're not making the type of investment in the type of plays that are going to produce enough oil to last for the long term. And so they're going to have to just drill like crazy to try to keep up, and they're not going to be able to do it over the long run without that more substantial investment.
Interesting. Okay, so one final thing. You mentioned massive projects, and this may tie into where I'm going next, because I wanted to ask you about offshore, an area I don't really delve into too much, but I have seen a lot of contradicting reports about the future of offshore. Is it going to be profitable? And so what are your kind of thoughts on offshore for the short term, at least?
It's going to be very profitable over the years because we're not doing enough of the deep projects because they're expensive. So I believe that they will be over a period of time. But as you know, oil's a boom and bust industry. And during the bust period, a lot of these projects were canceled. And so they're not going to happen, right? And so what will happen is for a lot of these projects that come back online, prices are going to have to get a lot higher. And when they do, they'll bring the projects back online. And some of those projects that get brought online might not be brought on fast enough to take advantage of the price spike.
Okay, great. Well, look, you have been so gracious with your time. We appreciate it. Is there anything that you want to plug or promote that we did not get to today?
No, not at all. I mean, watch us each day on the Fox Business Network. And if you want, you can get my daily energy report. I cover the reports every day. Just give me a call at 888-264-5665, or you can email me at pflynn@pricegroup.com.
Awesome. And we will link to all of that in the show notes. You can find all of Phil's information, where you can find him, and how to get that market report. And I think you can tell by the content of this interview, it should be worth the time to get that done. Thank you so much for coming on. We look to have you on again in the future to see where this price actually shapes out and how to look at things moving forward.
There we go. Brian, I love the bullish guys. Don't be too bearish. No, just kidding. All right.
Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, buddy. Bye-bye.
Really enjoyed the discussion with Phil, and we will see if he is right or if I'm right or both of us are wrong, which is always a possibility when you're talking about prices, but we enjoyed it nonetheless. Be sure to check out all of his information and catch him on Fox News Business as well, as you can watch him talk about the market and what's going on there on a regular basis. You can find all that information, again, at globalenergymedia.com. One final note, if you're looking to work in South Africa, we have some opportunities, some companies that we're looking to partner with. Reach out and send me an email. Go to globalenergymedia.com/contact and let me know. We'd be happy to see if we can put you to work down there. Not necessarily personnel we're looking for, but companies that are in energy efficiency, just various things we have going on. globalenergymedia.com/contact is where you can reach me. As always, thank you so much for tuning in, and until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.